Ever get that feeling?
Yeah.
Like you've been speaking the same language your whole life, and then bam, it hits you. Those words, they've been echoing through history for centuries.
Yeah.
That's what we're diving into today, the journey of the Aramaic language and how it's intertwined with Assyrian heritage. You sent over that Echoes of Assyria episode, and wow, did it spark some thoughts?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, really. Not just about dusty grammar rules, but how a language, it becomes more than words. It's a carrier of culture, a marker of identity, and a living record of a people's journey through time.
Absolutely. And this particular story takes us all the way back to ancient Assyria. We're talking grand empires, powerful kings. What was their language of choice again?
That would be Akkadian. Think of it as the linguistic VIP of its time, the language of diplomacy, administration, all the official stuff that held this vast empire together. In a way, Akkadian was the ancient equivalent of, say, English in today's globalized world.
Okay, so we've got Akkadian as the top dog. But then Aramaic starts to emerge on the scene. What sparked its rise to prominence?
Picture this. Bustling trade routes crisscrossing the ancient Near East, merchants needed a way to communicate. And Aramaic, with its relatively simple alphabetic writing system, kind of stepped in to bridge the gap. It was accessible, efficient, and spread like wildfire along these trade routes.
So while those Akkadian scribes were still scratching away at their complex cuneiform, Aramaic was already gaining traction with everyday people.
Exactly. You see Akkadian with its thousands of cuneiform characters, it was pretty difficult to master. Aramaic, on the other hand, used an alphabet. Much more user-friendly. This ease of learning made it a hit not just with traders, but also with everyday folks. It's like the difference between trying to decipher hieroglyphics versus picking up a modern alphabet. And as people migrated and mingled, languages naturally blended and shifted. It wasn't long before Aramaic started appearing in official Assyrian documents, even alongside Akkadian.
It's a good reminder that languages aren't static, are they? They're constantly evolving alongside the societies that use them.
Precisely. But here's where it gets really interesting. Around the 7th century BCE, Aramaic was officially recognized in Assyrian administration. That's how deeply it had woven itself into the fabric of the empire. But there was another major event on the horizon, something that would catapult Aramaic onto the world stage and have implications for centuries to come: the Babylonian exile.
Okay, now that rings a bell. But for those of us who might need a refresher.
Imagine this. The Babylonian Empire, with their eyes on expansion, conquered the Assyrians. As part of their strategy, they exiled many of the Jewish people from their homeland, scattering them across their territory. During this tumultuous period away from their homes and familiar surroundings, Aramaic became a unifying force.
So it became the lingua franca for these exiled communities. This language, born in ancient Assyria, finds itself adopted by the Jewish diaspora. That's quite the journey already, and just a taste of the impact to come.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of impact, this is where we see Aramaic's influence on religious texts that are still studied and revered today. Think about it. Parts of the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, these central texts of Judaism, they bear the mark of Aramaic influence. For example, did you know that some of the original words spoken by Jesus, like those in the Lord's Prayer, were likely in Aramaic? Talk about a linguistic legacy.
Wow, I never made that connection before. It really hits home how these ancient languages, they're still woven into the fabric of our world. And speaking of connections, the podcast then takes us down another branch of this linguistic family tree with Syriac.
Yeah.
Help us unpack that one.
So think of Syriac as Aramaic's direct descendant, emerging around the 1st century CE. It's like Aramaic had a baby, and that baby grew up with its own unique linguistic personality. Syriac inherited Aramaic's easy-to-learn alphabet and used it to kind of spread its own unique flavor.
And this flavor really resonated with certain communities, right?
Absolutely, particularly with early Christians in the Near East. Syriac became central to their faith, a language of liturgy, hymns, and theological discussions. It wasn't just for scholars either. It blossomed in literature, poetry, philosophy, you name it. Syriac was there, spreading its linguistic wings.
That's remarkable. From the bustling marketplaces of ancient Assyria to the heart of religious texts and intellectual thought, Aramaic and its offspring Syriac have certainly left their mark. But like all good things, this period of linguistic dominance, it couldn't last forever, could it?
Sadly, no. Just as empires rise and fall, languages, too, experience periods of expansion and decline. For Aramaic, a major turning point came with the rise of a new force in the 7th century CE, the Arabic language.
With the rise of Islam and the Islamic conquest.
Precisely. With the spread of the Islamic Empire, Arabic quickly established itself as the language of administration, scholarship, and religion. This shift in power dynamics had a significant impact on Aramaic's reach.
So with Arabic taking center stage, what became in Aramaic? Did it simply fade away?
It's a question that leads us to a crucial aspect of Assyrian heritage, the idea of Assyrian continuity. And to really grasp that, we need to understand what happened to Aramaic next.
Okay, so we're at a crossroads. Arabic's on the rise, reshaping the linguistic landscape.
Right.
And Aramaic's influence is starting to recede. This is where that idea of Assyrian continuity comes into play, right? Some argue that Assyrian culture simply vanished. But this podcast pushes back on that, doesn't it?
It does. While Aramaic's geographical reach may have shrunk, it didn't disappear. Instead, it retreated to its heartlands, those places where its roots ran deepest. Think parts of Iraq, Syria, Iran. Even to this day, you'll find communities where Aramaic dialects are still spoken, still shaping daily life. It's a testament to the Assyrian people and their enduring cultural legacy.
You know, it reminds me of that saying, the oak sleeps in the acorn. Even if empires crumble and languages evolve, the essential spirit, the cultural DNA, can persist. But this idea of Assyrian continuity, it's not without its skeptics, is it?
You're right. The podcast directly addresses this debate, acknowledging that some scholars view Assyrian continuity as more myth than reality. They argue that the Assyrians, after their empire fell, were simply absorbed into other cultures, their distinct identity fading away.
Yeah, I can see how someone might come to that conclusion, especially with the rise of new empires and languages. But the podcast presents a different perspective, doesn't it?
It does. It encourages us to look beyond the fall of empires and the shifts in linguistic dominance. The evidence, they argue, is in the details woven into the fabric of Assyrian culture even today.
Details like?
Well, for starters, there's language. As we've discussed, Aramaic dialects persist a direct link to ancient Assyrian heritage. But it goes beyond that. Think about traditional Assyrian music, the haunting melodies, the use of instruments like the zurna and the daf. These are echoes of ancient rituals and celebrations passed down through generations.
That's fascinating. I'm starting to see how this idea of continuity plays out. It's not about remaining frozen in time, but rather about retaining that cultural core while adapting and evolving.
Exactly. And the podcast gives another compelling example, religious practice. Many Assyrians today identify as Christians, but their faith is interwoven with ancient Mesopotamian traditions and symbolism, a fascinating blend of old and new. Think about it celebrating Easter with ancient Assyrian symbols of rebirth. That's a tangible link to the past.
It really makes you question that whole lost civilization narrative, doesn't it? This isn't about a people erased from history, but rather a culture that's found ways to survive and thrive amidst incredible change.
It's a vital distinction, and the podcast makes a point of highlighting those who are actively working to preserve this heritage for future generations. They talk about Assyrian communities around the world, organizing festivals, establishing language schools, and even using social media to connect and share their traditions.
That's amazing. It speaks to a deep sense of pride and a powerful desire to keep those cultural embers burning bright. It makes you realize language isn't just about words on a page or sounds in the air, is it?
It's the lifeblood of a culture. And as long as that language is spoken, sung, and celebrated, the spirit of a people lives on.
So we've journeyed from the grandeur of ancient empires to the quiet resilience of communities keeping their heritage alive. You know, it really drives home the point that history isn't just something you read about in textbooks. It's alive and breathing in the language we speak, the music we listen to, the stories we pass on.
Absolutely. And I think that's the beauty of diving deep into a topic like this. We start to see these connections everywhere, how the echoes of ancient Assyria are still resonating today in the language traditions and even struggles of the Assyrian people.
And speaking of those struggles, the podcast ends on a rather thought-provoking note. The idea that teaching Aramaic is vital for preserving Assyrian identity in a globalized world. It really made me think, can a language truly survive, let alone flourish solely within its community? Or does it need to find new relevant, new speakers to thrive in this interconnected world? It's a question worth pondering, listeners, a question worth pondering.